Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here to the north of the front line, where we see that in the direction of the east of Terni, the Russians have made a small advancement here in the forest lines. The Russians managed to advance here within the southern parts of the northern forest lines, as the Russians are here attempting to push onwards towards Terni, both in the northern and southern parts of the forest lines and forest patches. The Russians are continuously attempting to, in this section of the front line, inch closer and closer to the village of Terni as they move through the forest lines and fight through the Ukrainian fortifications that are present there. The Ukrainians have built fortifications all throughout these forest lines and forest patches. As such, the fighting taking place here is very intense, and the Russians are struggling to push through. But over the past few weeks, the Russians have managed to push and push throughout the forest patches and are now very close to the villages of Terni and Yampolivka here to the south. The fighting continues in the section of the front line, and we move on to the direction of Avdiivka, where following the capture of Avdiivka, the Russians have not entered in operational pause yet. They are instead fighting in the direction of the village of Lastoshkine, as they are attempting to take advantage of the capture of Avdiivka to capture the village. If the Russians manage to capture this village, it would spell a huge issue for the Ukrainian positions in Sheverne as well as Tonenke, here to the southwest of these positions. If the Russians manage to capture Lastoshkine, they may launch attacks towards Tonenke and Sheverne from all directions in an attempt to cut off the supplies here to the north, as the Ukrainians have this river line here to the south of Orelivka, which separates the northern and southern parts. And if the Russians capture Lastoshkine, they could attack in the direction of Orelivka or in the direction of Tonenke and Sheverne. If the villages of Tonenke and Sheverne are attacked from the north, we can see here that they are much weaker in this section of the front line. The biggest strength of these two villages is that in the southern direction, there are multiple layers of fortifications and forest lines that allowed the Ukrainians to hold on to these positions, no matter how hard the Russians were pushing for them. But in the northern parts, there's hardly any of such fortifications. The Russians can capture Lastoshkine, move through the forest lines here to the north, and then there will only be this fortification here to the northeast of Tonenke in the forest areas that will allow the Ukrainians to hold on to these positions. Instead, here to the north of Sheverne, there's nothing but empty locations, and in the north of Tonenke, there's nothing here as well. There's that area to the northwest of Tonenke, which would serve as a flank protection of Tonenke, as well as here to the southeast of the village. These two would allow the Ukrainians to have some sort of defense against such a Russian attack. However, the Russians can also move here to the south of Lastoshkine and attack in the direction of Sheverne from this direction. There's also this road here to the south of Lastoshkine. There's also the possibility of the Russians moving through the forest lines and then through them, similar to in the direction of Terni, where they are fighting through the forested areas to reach the villages. They could do the same here, and they could even combine it with assaults from the south. In the end, what matters is that with the loss of Lastoshkine, the Ukrainians would face multiple angles of attack from the Russians. The Russians could expand their areas of attack to a much wider front compared to just the southern parts. This is why this fight over Lastoshkine is very significant, and the Ukrainians will likely put a lot of resources into holding the village for as long as possible to make sure that they can create a second line of defense, which is reported to span from the village of Berdishi here to the north, in the north direction towards these villages here to the north, through the roads here to the west, and down to Nitailove, which is pretty much untouched by the Russians. Therefore, this would be a significant defensive line for a second line of defense of the Ukrainians here to the west of Avdiivka. And then following that, there is the line here by the river lines, which is one that the Ukrainians did not want the Russians to push through. So essentially what I'm saying is that with the Russians pushing here to the west of Avdiivka, there's likely going to be continuous attempts by them to push in a westward direction and get a foothold, capturing the villages of Lastoshkine, Tonenke, and Sheverne, before moving on to the next line of defense, which would span here from Osheretine down south and all the way to Nitailove, as the Russians are close to capturing Pervomaiske and possibly also in the direction of Nevelske. The Russians would continue pressuring in the southern direction as well as in the northern direction. The fighting will also span to the Novokalinove direction, as Russians now have a lot more troops free from the commitment of storming a city. They likely will have to need to take some sort of break because fighting in urban areas are very tough. Therefore, the Russians will likely rotate these units out, and with 40,000 or so, some estimate between 30 to 50,000 Russian soldiers, the middle would be 40,000 being freed up from the Battle of Avdiivka. They can now spread out to a wider front, and therefore the Russians can expand their operations in a wider front instead of focusing just on Avdiivka. Moving further south, there is a new offensive that has started in the direction of Robotyne. The Russians have launched multiple attacks here to the south of Robotyne. They managed to capture the fortifications and trenches to the south of the village. With this, the Russians will now be able to launch attacks towards the village itself. There's also attacks here to the south of the village in between the Bulge area to the northeast of Novorogopivka. As for the northwest of Robotyne, there are multiple attacks by the Russians. This includes armored vehicles to try and cut off the supply road to and from Robotyne. There's continuous fighting over all of the trenches and fortifications all throughout the Robotyne front, also in the eastern direction from Verbova and so on, as the Russians launch a new offensive with 2 divisions. The 2 divisions taking part in this offensive operations that are taking place here from the Verbova to Kupane in the direction of Robotyne are the 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division and the 76th Pskov Airborne Division, which means that both of these divisions are infantry-based. It's a VDV division and Motorized Rifle Division, which are both pretty much infantry-based groups with a lot of artillery and a lot of infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. As such, the operations taking place are pretty much armored vehicles driving to the front line, dropping off soldiers, and the soldiers in the cover of artillery try to advance and capture these fortifications. So you'll unlikely see any big movements in this direction despite 2 divisions being committed to the fighting in this section of the front line. We'll likely see continuous assaults by infantry-based assaults groups to capture fortifications and trenches around Robotyne before storming the village itself with armored personnel carriers. There's of course also going to be tanks involved, but this is very few compared to actual assaults with armored regiments, tank regiments, etc. that are more armored focused than these infantry-based divisions. According to the information received so far, these divisions are also getting a lot of support from the Russian Air Force. So the Russian Air Force is now focusing on this section of the front line after the fighting over Avdiivka. Their strategy is likely to bypass the minefields with the use of infantry to infiltrate these positions, capture Robotyne, similar to the Ukrainian strategy throughout the summer offensive, until that they have covered the supply line and pushed the Ukrainians to a withdrawal away from this section. And then they'll likely try to improve their positions a bit in preparation for an offensive operations in direction of Orikhiv or Hulyai here at the southern front. So it's a very limited offensive despite the large number of forces used. This is likely just to continue the fighting, to continue the battle of attrition. The more fighting that goes on, the faster the battle of attrition will end. As the more fighting takes place, the more units will get involved in these fights and the more units will be lost. As such, the Russians are looking to speed up the fighting by continuously launching these operations all across the front line. We're not just seeing the fighting here in Zaporizhia front, we're seeing a continuous assault by the Russians here in the direction of Avdiivka. Fighting also continues in the direction of Novomikhailivka. As for the northern parts by Terny and Yapolivka, fighting continues there as well. So there's constant attacks by the Russians all across the front line from Sinkivka here to the northeast by Kupiansk, Terny and Yapolivka in the forest areas, as well as the forests here to the south of Kremin and Srebrenki forest area. Fighting continues in the Bakhmut direction, in the direction of Avdiivka, west of Marinka in the village of Rihorivka, here in the direction of Novomikhailivka and Bopieda, in the direction of Volodar, is also movement there as well, and then in the direction of the Staromayorsk, Uroshaina direction, in the Vermevsky Ledge area, there's also fighting there. Finally, in the Robotyne direction, with these advances made by the Russians here to the south of the village, which was also geolocated with this footage here, we see that there is constant efforts by the Russians all across the front line from Zaporizhia to Kupiansk, where they are launching offensive operations with infantry-based assaults. This means that generally the Russian infantry losses may be much higher now than it was a year ago, while the armored losses are much lower. But what this really means is that the Russians have a significant amount of troops available for these operations, and that they're able to launch these operations all across the front line shows that they have the capacity to do this. And as such, we may see that as the Russians continue building up their forces in the future, we'll see larger operations taking place by the end of 2024, the start of 2025. And that's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.